The story has endured for centuries, not because it can be proven, not because it can be found, but because it speaks to something unresolved in human belief. The Holy Grail, a vessel of divine power, a symbol of spiritual longing. Its meaning has never been fixed. It has shifted with culture, belief, and the people who carried the story forward. Some believed it was real. Others believed it was never meant to be. What matters is not whether the Grail existed as a physical object. What matters is why people believed it did. The idea of the Grail did not begin in history. It began in myth. Long before medieval Europe, ancient cultures spoke of sacred vessels, objects believed to hold life, wisdom, or divine favor. Containers that blurred the boundary between the human and the sacred. In Celtic tradition, there were cauldrons said to restore the dead, vessels that never ran empty, objects that rewarded the worthy and punished the unprepared. These stories were not explanations. They were reflections. They spoke of restraint, of intention, of the belief that access to the sacred was never automatic. Worthiness mattered. As centuries passed, these myths did not disappear. They softened. They adapted. They were absorbed into new belief systems as cultures changed. When Christianity spread across Europe, older stories were not erased. They were reinterpreted. Symbols were given new meaning. Sacred objects were reshaped through theology. And the Grail took on a new identity. No longer a cauldron of magic, no longer a pagan relic. Now, it was spoken of as a cup, a simple vessel, transformed by association, a cup linked to sacrifice, a quiet association with suffering, and finally, redemption. The Grail became less about abundance and more about grace, less about power and more about humility. By the 12th century, poets and storytellers began to write about the Grail in new ways. These were not historians. They were not theologians. They were chroniclers of belief. In their stories, knights set out on long journeys, not to conquer, not to claim riches, but to seek something sacred. Many failed. Some were turned away. Others never returned. The Grail did not reveal itself easily. And when it did appear, it did not appear to everyone. Only those who demonstrated restraint. Only those who asked the right questions. Only those who understood that the quest itself was the test. These stories carried a quiet instruction. Strength alone was not enough. Courage without humility meant nothing. Power, pursued for its own sake, led nowhere. The Grail was not a reward. It was a measure. This idea resonated deeply in medieval Europe, a world shaped by violence, faith, and uncertainty. To people living in that time, the Grail represented something rare, not victory, but meaning, a reminder that the sacred was not seized. It was approached. And it was here, at the intersection of myth and belief, that the Grail moved closer to history. Not as a confirmed artifact, but as a powerful idea. An idea strong enough to inspire devotion, strong enough to justify long journeys, strong enough to be guarded, protected, and hidden. In the sections that follow, the story moves outward. The Grail will be traced through its different forms, why it was imagined as a cup, why that image endured, and why other interpretations emerged alongside it. The role of relics will become clearer, how belief attached itself to objects, how vessels, spears, and sacred containers came to represent something far larger than themselves. The focus will then shift to those who sought to protect such ideas. Orders bound by oath, knights shaped as much by faith as by steel, and the belief that certain knowledge was not meant for everyone. From there, the line between legend and history narrows. Not because certainty is reached, but because conviction becomes visible. Each section stands on its own. There is no rush to reach an ending. The story unfolds gradually, one belief at a time. When the Grail moved from myth into medieval belief, its form began to matter. Not because shape determined truth, but because objects give belief something to rest upon. Across cultures, humans have always attached meaning to vessels, containers, objects designed to hold something precious. The idea is simple. What holds life must itself be significant. In Christian tradition, the Grail became most commonly imagined as a cup, not ornate, not powerful in appearance, a humble vessel. This was no accident. The cup represented containment rather than conquest. It did not strike. It did not command. It received. In this way, the Grail mirrored the values it was meant to embody: humility, sacrifice, restraint. A weapon can be taken by force. A crown can be seized. But a cup must be offered. This symbolism resonated deeply in medieval Europe, a world where violence was common and power was rarely gentle. The Grail stood in contrast to that reality. It suggested that the sacred was not something to be taken. It was something to be approached. Over time, however, the Grail did not remain fixed as a cup alone. In some traditions, it was described as a stone, a sacred object fallen from heaven, associated with light, wisdom, and divine origin. In others, it appeared as a reliquary, a container for holy remnants, fragments of bone, cloth, or blood believed to carry spiritual presence. These variations did not weaken the legend. They strengthened it. Each form reflected a different way of understanding faith. The cup spoke of humility. The stone spoke of permanence. The reliquary spoke of proximity to the sacred. All of them shared one idea: that meaning could be carried, protected, contained. As belief in relics grew, so too did the importance of objects in spiritual life. Medieval churches became places of preservation, not just of scripture, but of physical fragments believed to connect heaven and earth. Pilgrims traveled long distances to see them, to touch them, to be near them. These journeys were acts of devotion, but they were also acts of belief in proximity, that holiness could be closer, that grace could be near. The Grail, whether real or imagined, fit perfectly into this worldview. It was not simply a story. It was a concept that made sense within the logic of the time. If holiness could be contained, then it could also be guarded. If it could be guarded, then someone must be responsible for doing so. This quiet shift matters, because once belief attaches itself to objects, questions of protection inevitably follow. Who would be worthy of such a task? Who could be trusted to guard something sacred without seeking to possess it? The Grail did not demand strength. It demanded restraint. And in a world shaped by oaths, hierarchy, and devotion, the idea of guardianship began to take form, not as myth, but as duty. It is here, as belief turns toward protection, that the story begins to narrow, away from abstract symbolism, and toward real people, real orders, and real conviction. As belief in the Grail became more firmly attached to objects, another question quietly followed. If something sacred could be contained, then it could also be protected. And if it could be protected, someone would have to be responsible for doing so. In the medieval world, responsibility was rarely abstract. It took shape through oath, through hierarchy, through duty. The idea of guardianship was not new. Kings guarded lands. Churches guarded relics. Monasteries guarded knowledge. But the Grail suggested a different kind of protection. Not ownership, not possession, stewardship. To guard something sacred was not to claim it. It was to ensure it remained untouched by ambition. This distinction mattered because belief in relics brought both devotion and danger. Objects believed to hold divine power attracted pilgrims, but they also attracted opportunists. Faith and desire often traveled together, and so the medieval world responded in the way it always had, by creating structures, orders bound by rules, by vows, by clearly defined purpose. Some were shaped by faith, others were formed for war, and some existed between both worlds. These orders were shaped by oath above all else. An oath was not merely a promise, it was a binding act, believed to carry spiritual consequence. To break an oath was not simply dishonorable, it was dangerous. This belief gave structure to medieval society, and it gave authority to those who swore to serve something higher than themselves. In this environment, the idea of sacred guardianship felt natural. If the Grail represented divine grace, then only those bound by discipline, humility, and faith could be trusted near it. This is where legend begins to intersect with reality, not through proof, but through plausibility, because real groups existed whose lives were shaped by oath, devotion, and secrecy. Groups whose movements were restricted, whose rules were strict, whose inner workings were known only to their members. They were not created to protect the Grail. But belief has a way of attaching itself to existing structures, especially when those structures appear suited to the task. The medieval imagination did not require evidence in the modern sense. It required coherence. And the idea of guardians fit neatly within the worldview of the time. Stories began to circulate, not official accounts, not records, but whispered associations, that certain orders knew more than they revealed, that some knowledge was preserved rather than displayed, that sacred objects were moved, hidden, or entrusted. These stories were rarely specific. They did not name locations, they did not provide dates. Their power came from suggestion, from the sense that something important was being kept out of sight. As the centuries passed, these suggestions hardened into legend, and certain names began to surface more frequently than others, not because evidence demanded it, but because symbolism allowed it. Some orders embodied the exact balance the Grail required: faith without isolation, discipline without withdrawal, service without possession. They lived publicly, yet guarded privately. They swore obedience, yet operated beyond ordinary authority. This combination made them fertile ground for belief, especially belief in guardianship. What mattered was not whether they held the Grail. What mattered was that people believed they could. Belief does not need proof to endure. It needs alignment. And in the medieval world, alignment mattered more than fact. As the story continues, this alignment narrows further, toward one order in particular, an order whose rise and fall would later become inseparable from the Grail itself. But before that connection is examined, something else must be understood. Why the search eventually ended, why guardianship gave way to silence, and why, even in absence, belief survived. By the early 12th century, Europe was changing. Pilgrimage routes had expanded, trade had increased, and the Christian world had extended its reach far beyond its traditional borders. At the center of this expansion stood Jerusalem, For centuries, the city had been a destination of faith, but following the First Crusade in 1099, it became something else as well. A place of tension, of danger, and of profound symbolic importance. Pilgrims continued to arrive in large numbers. Many travelled unarmed. Many were unfamiliar with the land. The roads were not safe. It was in this environment, around the year 1119, that a small group of knights came together for a specific purpose. They did not set out to conquer territory. They did not seek wealth or political power. Their task was narrow: to protect pilgrims travelling to and from the holy sites. This group called themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. History remembers them by a shorter name, the Knights Templar. At first, they were few in number. They owned little, and they lived under strict discipline. Their headquarters was established on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, in a structure believed at the time to stand on the remains of Solomon's temple. This location mattered, not because of what it hid, but because of what it represented. The Temple Mount was one of the most symbolically charged places in the medieval world, associated with kingship, divine presence, and ancient authority. To operate from there was to exist at the intersection of faith, power, and history. The Templars took vows similar to those of monks: poverty, chastity, obedience. But unlike monks, they were trained for war. They lived between two worlds, bound to religious life, yet prepared for violence. This combination was unprecedented, and it granted them a unique position within medieval society. Over time, the order grew rapidly. Kings donated land. Nobles offered sons. The church granted privileges. The Templars became accountable to no local authority, only to the Pope. They developed a vast network across Europe and the Near East. Farms, fortresses, safe houses, and something else: a system of finance. Pilgrims could deposit money with the Templars in one country and withdraw it in another. This reduced theft and quietly transformed the order into one of the most powerful financial institutions of the medieval world. With wealth came suspicion. With secrecy came speculation. The Templars did not advertise their inner workings. They were bound by oath, and their rituals were private. In an age where transparency was rare, this alone was enough to generate rumors. Stories began to circulate that the Templars had uncovered ancient knowledge beneath the Temple Mount, that they possessed relics of immense power, that they guarded something more than money and land. These stories were not supported by records, but they endured. And the Grail, already embedded in the imagination of Europe, found a new home within these suspicions. The connection was not official. It was not declared. It was implied. The Templars appeared to fit the role perfectly. They were disciplined. They were devoted. They were powerful. And they were secretive. If the Grail existed, people reasoned, who else could be trusted with it? This logic did not require proof. It required coherence. And in the medieval mind, coherence was enough. As the Order's influence expanded, so too did its vulnerability. By the early 14th century, the political landscape had shifted. Power had centralized. Kings were less tolerant of independent authority. The Templars, once indispensable, became inconvenient. In 1307, the Order was abruptly arrested across France, accused of heresy, of secret rituals, of corruption. Many of these charges were extracted under torture. Records were inconsistent. Testimonies contradicted one another. But the outcome was decisive. The order was dissolved, its assets seized, its leaders imprisoned or executed, and with their disappearance, the rumors intensified. If the Templars had guarded something sacred, then it must have been removed before the arrests. Hidden, transferred, lost. The absence of evidence became fuel for belief. And the Grail, already elusive by nature, slipped further into legend. What remained was not proof, but possibility. After the Knights Templar were dissolved, the silence that followed was louder than anything they had said while they existed. Records vanished. Property changed hands. Whole witnesses contradicted one another. And into that absence, stories rushed in. Almost immediately, rumors began to circulate that the Templars had not been arrested because they were corrupt, but because they knew too much. The focus of these rumors returned again and again to Jerusalem. For nearly 20 years, the Templars had lived on the Temple Mount, a site believed to stand above the remains of Solomon's temple. In medieval belief, this was no ordinary location. Solomon's temple was associated with divine authority, sacred knowledge, and objects too powerful to be handled casually. It was believed to be the place where heaven and earth once touched. If something ancient had survived the fall of the old world, people believed it would be found there. Stories began to suggest that during their early years, the Templars had excavated beneath the Temple Mount. Not openly, not recklessly, quietly. No contemporary document confirms this, but no document rules it out either. And in the centuries that followed, the absence of denial became fertile ground for imagination. The first object to appear in these stories was the Ark of the Covenant. According to biblical tradition, the Ark was a sacred chest containing the tablets of the law. It was said to carry divine presence, to be too dangerous to touch without ritual preparation. If the Ark had ever been hidden, people reasoned, Solomon's temple was the most likely place. And if anyone had the discipline, secrecy, and authority to uncover it, it would have been the Templars. Soon, other objects were added to the list: the Holy Lance, fragments of the True Cross, sacred vessels, ancient documents. The Grail entered these stories not as a single, defined object, but as a category, a container of meaning. Whether imagined as a cup, a reliquary, or something more abstract, the Grail fit the same pattern as the Ark. Both were said to contain divine presence. Both were associated with covenant and legitimacy. Both were believed to be too powerful for ordinary possession. What mattered was not whether these objects were real. It was that the ideas surrounding them were coherent. The Templars appeared to embody the role of guardians perfectly. They were bound by oath. They lived under strict discipline. They answered only to the Pope. Their internal practices were secret. Their movements were controlled. Their wealth was immense. If something sacred had been discovered, people believed it would have been entrusted to them, not displayed, not recorded, guarded. As the accusations against the Templars spread, they became increasingly fantastical. Some claimed the Order had uncovered sealed chambers beneath the temple. Others believed they had recovered knowledge that threatened church authority. There were whispers of forbidden texts, of alternative histories, of truths that could not be spoken publicly. These stories gained traction not because they were proven, but because they explained something unsettling: the speed of the Templars' rise, the depth of their influence, the abruptness of their destruction. To medieval observers, it felt as though the Order had been erased too completely, and complete erasure invites suspicion. When the Templars were arrested, no Grail was found, no Ark was recovered, no relic was presented. But this absence only sharpened belief. If something had existed, it must have been moved, hidden, entrusted elsewhere. And so, the story shifted. The Grail was no longer something the Templars held. It became something they had passed on. With that shift, the Grail escaped history. It entered legend. After the Templars vanished, the story of the Grail did not disappear with them. It changed shape. Without an order to attach itself to, the Grail no longer belonged to institutions. It drifted instead toward ideas. Across late medieval Europe, the Grail began to appear less as a physical object and more as a form of knowledge. Something concealed. Something transmitted quietly. Something understood by few. This shift can be seen in the literature that followed. In earlier stories, the Grail was sought. In later ones, it was guarded, not behind walls, but behind understanding. Writers began to describe the Grail as a mystery that revealed itself only to those who were prepared, not by lineage alone, not by force, but by insight. The quest became internal. At the same time, Europe was changing. Universities expanded. Manuscripts circulated. Ancient texts were rediscovered and translated. Knowledge itself was becoming a form of power. And with power came caution. Ideas that challenged authority were not always welcomed. Some were debated openly. Others moved quietly, preserved by small groups and passed on selectively. Within this environment, the Grail began to represent something broader, not merely a relic from the past, but a symbol of truth withheld from the many. Secret societies emerged in different forms across Europe. Some were guilds, some were philosophical circles, some were fraternal orders. They differed in purpose, but they shared a pattern: initiation, symbolism, layered meaning. Knowledge was not delivered all at once. It was revealed gradually. This method of transmission mirrored the Grail stories themselves. The unprepared would see nothing. The prepared might glimpse something more. Over time, the Grail was reinterpreted as a symbol of this process. A vessel not for blood or stone, but for wisdom. Something that could not be taken, only received. This interpretation allowed the Grail to survive the end of medieval crusading culture. As literal belief in relics declined, symbolic belief intensified. The Grail no longer needed to exist physically. It existed as an idea that explained why some knowledge was hidden, why some truths were guarded, why history seemed incomplete. This shift also allowed the Grail to attach itself to new narratives. Stories of lineage, of inheritance, of secrets passed through blood rather than objects. It is here that the Grail begins to move toward genealogy, not yet as a claim, but as a possibility. If knowledge could be inherited, perhaps sanctity could be as well. If truth was preserved through succession, then bloodlines mattered. These ideas did not originate with the Grail, but the Grail gave them a language. And in that language, a new interpretation began to take form. As the centuries passed after the fall of the Knights Templar, the story of the Grail continued to change. Not abruptly, not dramatically. It shifted in small, almost imperceptible steps. The world that had produced the original Grail stories was fading. Feudal structures were weakening. The authority of the Church, once unchallenged, was beginning to fracture. And as institutional certainty declined, interest in alternative origins began to grow. People did not abandon belief. They redirected it. Instead of asking where the Grail was hidden, a different question emerged. What if the Grail had never been an object at all? What if it had always been something that moved? This idea did not appear in official theology. It developed quietly in the margins of scripture, legend, and genealogy. The focus of this new interpretation was not the cup itself, but what the cup was said to contain: blood. In ancient and medieval thought, blood carried meaning far beyond biology. It was associated with inheritance, legitimacy, and divine favor. Kings ruled by blood. Dynasties justified power through descent. Sacred authority was believed to pass through lineage. Within this worldview, the idea that holiness could be inherited was not radical. It was familiar. As the Grail story evolved, some began to reinterpret its symbolism through this lens. If the Grail had contained sacred blood, then perhaps it was not a vessel that mattered. Perhaps it was the blood itself. This interpretation did not begin with Jesus. It began with Mary Magdalene. In the canonical Gospels, Mary Magdalene appears as a devoted follower of Jesus. She is present at critical moments. She is named when others are not. In later, non-canonical texts, her role becomes more complex. She is described as a figure entrusted with understanding, someone who comprehended teachings others struggled to accept. These texts do not describe a marriage. They do not describe children. But they do establish something important. Mary Magdalene was not peripheral. Over time, this importance was reinterpreted. In periods when authority was contested, reinterpretation often went further than the original texts allowed. Stories began to circulate, suggesting that Mary Magdalene was not merely a follower, but a companion. That she had carried a child. That the sacred story had not ended with crucifixion, but continued through descent. This idea did not arise in the first centuries of Christianity. That absence matters. It emerged much later, during the medieval and early modern periods, at a time when lineage was being used to justify political power, when royal bloodlines were scrutinized, traced, and mythologized. Within this context, the Grail began to be imagined as a genealogy, not a relic hidden in stone, but a living inheritance. If this were true, the implications were profound. Sacred authority would no longer reside in institutions. It would reside in people. The Grail would not need to be found. It would need to be recognized. This interpretation required a bridge between antiquity and medieval Europe, a lineage that could plausibly carry sacred blood forward through centuries. That bridge was found in the Merovingian dynasty. The Merovingians ruled parts of what is now France from the 5th to the 8th centuries. They were remembered as strange kings, surrounded by myth, even in their own time. Later, chroniclers described them as possessing unusual qualities. Long hair, said to signify sacred authority. Origins shrouded in legend. A right to rule that seemed to precede the church itself, in some accounts. They were portrayed as descendants of an ancient line, not documented, not confirmed, but suggested. The idea that the Merovingians carried a sacred bloodline did not appear in contemporary records. It developed retrospectively, centuries later. This delay is critical. It shows that the bloodline theory was not preserved knowledge, it was constructed meaning. People were looking backward, attempting to weave coherence into a fragmented past. The Grail provided the narrative framework. If sacred authority had survived the collapse of Rome, the rise of the Church, and the chaos of the early Middle Ages, it would have had to move quietly, hidden in plain sight. Genealogy offered that possibility. Within this framework, the Knights Templar were drawn back into the story, not as discoverers of the bloodline, but as guardians of its secret. Their role shifted again. They were no longer imagined as protectors of objects. They became protectors of people, or of knowledge about people. This association relied heavily on implication. The Templars' secrecy, their presence in Jerusalem, their sudden destruction, these elements made them suitable carriers of hidden truth. Whether or not they possessed such knowledge was secondary. What mattered was that they could have. And in myth-making, possibility often outweighs fact. By the modern era, these ideas had been fully integrated. The Grail was no longer a cup. It was a lineage, a sacred family line, a suppressed history. This interpretation gained renewed attention in the 20th century, not because new evidence emerged, but because modern audiences were primed for it. Institutions were questioned. Official narratives were distrusted. Hidden truths became compelling. The Grail as bloodline offered an alternative origin story, one that placed sanctity outside hierarchy, outside doctrine, outside control. It suggested that the sacred had survived not through monuments, but through continuity. Whether this interpretation is true is ultimately unanswerable. There is no historical evidence that Jesus married. There is no documented proof of a surviving bloodline. There is no genealogical record connecting such a lineage to medieval kings. But the persistence of the idea is revealing. It tells us less about the past and more about the needs of the present. The Grail as bloodline endures because it reframes power. It suggests that authority cannot be monopolized, that truth cannot be buried permanently, that something sacred survived beneath history itself. In this form, the Grail becomes almost indestructible. It cannot be destroyed. It cannot be seized. It can only be believed. And belief, once established, has a way of traveling far beyond its origins. As bloodline interpretations of the Grail gained attention, they did not remain abstract for long. They began attaching themselves to names. In particular, writers in the late 20th century focused on the Merovingian dynasty as a possible starting point. The Merovingians ruled large parts of what is now France, from the 5th to the 8th centuries. They were remembered as a strange and semi-mythic royal house, even by later medieval chroniclers. Some modern authors argued that their abrupt displacement by the Carolingians marked not just a political shift, but a suppression. According to these claims, the Merovingians represented an older form of legitimacy, one rooted not in papal approval, but in bloodline. From there, the theory extended outward. Books such as The Holy Blood and The Holy Grail, published in 1982 by Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln, proposed that fragments of this lineage may have survived within European nobility, not openly acknowledged, but quietly absorbed into later royal houses. The House of Lorraine was frequently mentioned, as were branches of the Bourbon line. Other writers suggested that the Sinclair family of Scotland, associated with Rosslyn Chapel, may have played a role in preserving symbolic or genealogical knowledge tied to the Grail tradition. These claims relied heavily on speculative genealogy, interrupted medieval records, symbolic interpretation of heraldry and architecture. Mainstream historians rejected the conclusions. They pointed out that medieval noble families intermarried extensively, that many European dynasties share common ancestors, and that tracing sacred lineage through incomplete records invites error. Nevertheless, the appeal of these ideas proved difficult to extinguish because they suggested something radical. That sacred authority might have flowed through families rather than institutions. That legitimacy could survive displacement, and that history itself might conceal continuities it no longer recognizes. In later interpretations, these theories were extended even further. Some authors suggested that because medieval dynasties intermingled with modern political families, traces of Merovingian ancestry could exist among contemporary figures. These assertions were speculative and unverified, but they reflected a broader impulse, a desire to believe that something ancient had survived beneath modern systems of power, that the Grail, understood as lineage rather than object, had never been lost, only dispersed. It is important to be clear. No genealogical evidence confirms these claims. No documentation establishes a continuous sacred bloodline into the present. But belief does not operate by documentation alone. It operates by narrative coherence. And for those drawn to the Grail story, the idea of inheritance offered a compelling answer. Not to where the Grail was hidden, but to who might carry it. By the early 20th century, the story of the Grail had travelled far from its medieval origins. It was no longer shaped by knights or monasteries, nor was it confined to poetry or legend. It had entered the modern world, and the modern world brought with it a dangerous assumption that history could be recovered, that lost authority could be reclaimed, and that ancient legitimacy could be used to justify present power. Nowhere did this assumption take a more extreme form than in Nazi Germany. Within the Nazi leadership, history was not treated as a record of the past. It was treated as a resource, something to be mined, reshaped, and weaponized. At the center of this approach was Heinrich Himmler. Himmler was not simply an administrator of the SS. He was deeply invested in myth, ancestry, and symbolic authority. He believed that power was inherited, that blood carried memory, and that ancient knowledge could be revived to legitimize modern dominance. For Himmler, the Grail was not a Christian relic. It was a symbol of ancestral supremacy. In his interpretation, the Grail represented the survival of an ancient, purified lineage, one that predated Christianity, one that could be aligned with racial ideology. This belief did not arise in isolation. It was supported by a broader movement within Nazi Germany that sought to replace Christian tradition with a reconstructed pagan past. Runes replaced scripture. Myth replaced doctrine. Ancestry replaced faith. Within this framework, the Grail became something to be sought, not for humility, but for validation. Under Himmler's direction, the SS established research units dedicated to investigating ancient history, folklore, and archaeology. These units were not academic in the conventional sense. Their purpose was not discovery, it was confirmation. They searched for evidence that supported ideological conclusions already drawn. Expeditions were launched across Europe. Castles were surveyed. Remote sites were examined. Legends were treated as maps. One location drew particular attention. Montségur, a ruined fortress in southern France, long associated with the Cathars. The Cathars were a medieval Christian sect who rejected material authority and church hierarchy. They were declared heretical and ultimately destroyed. Later legends suggested that before their defeat, the Cathars had safeguarded a sacred object. The Grail was quietly inserted into this narrative. There was no historical evidence linking Montségur to the Grail, but for those seeking symbolic continuity, the association was irresistible. Otto Rahn, a medievalist who explored Cathar history, became closely associated with these investigations. Rahn believed that medieval Grail legends might encode real historical events. His work fascinated Himmler, but it also alarmed him. Rahn's interpretations were poetic rather than ideological. They did not neatly support Nazi racial doctrine, and in a system that demanded conformity, ambiguity was dangerous. Rahn died in 1939, under circumstances that remain disputed. His fate became part of the Grail's modern mythology, not because of what he proved, but because of what he represented. A scholar caught between history and ideology. Despite extensive effort, Nazi expeditions did not recover the Grail. They did not uncover a sacred bloodline. They did not find relics of divine authority. But their failure did not weaken the myth. It transformed it. The search itself became proof. If the Grail had existed, it must have been hidden too well. If it had survived, it must have moved again. After the collapse of the Nazi regime, the consequences of ideological obsession became impossible to ignore. The devastation left behind by myth-driven power forced a reckoning. Grand narratives rooted in destiny were no longer acceptable. But fascination with the Grail did not disappear. It adapted. In the post-war world, the Grail shifted from ideology to curiosity, from state-sponsored obsession to private investigation. The lesson of the 20th century was not that the Grail was false. It was that belief, when untethered from restraint, could become destructive. And so the Grail retreated once more, not into silence, but into the hands of individuals rather than institutions. After the war, the Grail did not disappear. It changed hands again, not into the custody of governments, but into the hands of individuals, researchers without institutions, writers without departments, small groups working in the margins, convinced that something in the Grail story remained unfinished. The modern era produced a new kind of Grail seeker. Not the knight, not the monk, not the ideologue. The investigator. In southern France, one place kept drawing people back. Rennes-le-Château. A small village that became famous not because of medieval manuscripts, but because of a 19th century priest, Béranger Saunière. Saunière's sudden spending, renovations and unexplained income created a question that refused to settle. Where did the money come from? Over time, that question became a magnet. Treasure hunters arrived first, then researchers, then documentarians. In the 1970s and 1980s, Henry Lincoln, a BBC writer and researcher, became a key figure in pushing the Rennes-le-Château mystery into the public imagination. Lincoln's work didn't prove the Grail existed, but it did something more influential. It connected a local mystery to a much larger mythic network. Rennes-le-Château became linked, in popular culture, to secret documents, hidden genealogies, and the idea that history had been selectively curated. In 1982, the modern Grail story gained a new center of gravity. The book, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, by Michael Begant, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln. The book proposed that the Grail could be understood not as a chalice, but as a bloodline. It linked that idea to medieval France, the Merovingians, and the persistence of hidden inheritance. Whether one accepts these claims or rejects them, the impact is undeniable. The book didn't simply revive Grail interest, it rewired it. From that moment onward, Grail hunting increasingly meant connecting clues across texts, places, and genealogies, rather than digging for a cup. For many modern seekers, that shift was liberating. If the Grail was knowledge, then it could be pursued anywhere. In archives, in libraries, in maps, in overlooked symbols. And people began looking for symbols everywhere. Rosslyn Chapel became one of the most famous modern flashpoints, a 15th century chapel near Edinburgh, linked in later legend to the Sinclair family and to imagined Templar refuge routes. The modern Grail narrative did not begin at Rosslyn in the Middle Ages. It grew there in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as books and documentaries layered meaning onto stone carvings and family histories. Some writers went further still. Andrew Sinclair, for example, argued for patterns, roots, and encoded geographies tied to the Grail story in Scotland, presenting his own interpretations in books and related material. Most academic historians remain skeptical of these claims. But skepticism rarely kills a Grail story. It often strengthens it. Because the modern Grail hunter isn't always chasing certainty. They are chasing resonance, a sense that the world contains hidden layers, that the surface narrative of history is incomplete. And this is where the modern era becomes truly distinctive. Grail hunting becomes a lifestyle. People form research groups. They trade scans of documents. They debate translations. They map pilgrim routes and compare church alignments. They revisit the same villages and ruins year after year, hoping that a detail everyone else dismissed might finally click. The internet accelerated this dramatically. In the pre-digital era, Grail research moved at the speed of publishing. A new book every few years. A documentary series occasionally. In the digital era, the search becomes continuous. Forums and online groups formed around Rennes-le-Château and other Grail-associated locations, preserving discussions, sharing theories, and keeping the narrative alive, even when mainstream media moved on. Some of this work is careful and text-based. Some is chaotic. Some is indistinguishable from roleplay. But taken together, it shows something important. The Grail is no longer a medieval question. It is a modern hobby, a modern obsession, a modern identity. And it has casualties. Not always dramatic ones, but real nonetheless. Consider Otto Rahn, often mythologized as a Nazi Indiana Jones figure. Rahn was a German medievalist and researcher who became entangled with the SS and the Cathar Grail narrative around Montségur. He died in 1939, found frozen in the Alps, with his death widely reported as suicide, though later accounts and retellings speculate in different directions. Rahn's story is useful, not because it proves anything about the Grail, but because it shows what the Grail does to certain personalities. It attracts people who are willing to live inside the story, who blur research with devotion, who treat myth as a map. In the late 20th century and into the present, the Grail hunt has also been sustained by investigative filmmakers. Documentary makers have framed the Grail not as a solved mystery, but as an ongoing question, using travel, interviews, and site visits to keep the sense of pursuit alive for viewers. Series and episodes dedicated to the Grail have continued to appear on mainstream platforms, often presenting multiple interpretations, chalice, relic, or bloodline, and following researchers to locations that have become modern pilgrimage points. And this is the modern Grail ecosystem in its pure form. A cycle. A book proposes an interpretation. A documentary popularizes it. A community forms around it. A location becomes sacred through repetition. A new generation arrives and begins again. The Grail in modern times does not survive because it is hidden in a cave. It survives because it is hidden in pattern recognition. It offers the promise that the world is not random, that symbols connect, that the past is not finished speaking. Some modern seekers are driven by faith, some by curiosity, some by the thrill of secret knowledge. Others are driven by something quieter. They simply want to believe that history still has a door that hasn't been opened. And in a world where most mysteries are solved quickly, the Grail remains stubbornly unresolved. That unresolved quality is what makes it modern. Because modern people are not satisfied by relics alone. They want meaning, and the Grail, in all its forms, continues to offer a particular kind of meaning. The suggestion that something sacred was guarded, moved, passed on, not necessarily as an object, but as a story powerful enough to outlive the people who first told it. After centuries of searching, reinterpretation, and pursuit, the story of the Holy Grail does not conclude with discovery. It never has. Across this journey, the Grail has appeared in many forms. A cup, a relic, a lineage, a symbol, an obsession. Each form reflected the needs of the time that shaped it. In the medieval world, the Grail offered meaning in an age defined by faith and hierarchy. It asked questions of worthiness rather than conquest. As institutions grew powerful, the Grail shifted. It became hidden knowledge, something guarded rather than displayed. When bloodline theories emerged, the Grail became inheritance. A suggestion that sanctity could survive displacement and suppression. In the modern era, the Grail transformed again. It became a question mark, a challenge to official history. A reminder that some stories refuse to settle. What unites all these interpretations is not evidence, it is orientation. The Grail has never answered the question, what is true? It has always asked, what matters? Those who searched for the Grail were rarely seeking an object alone. They were seeking legitimacy, meaning, continuity. They wanted to know whether something sacred had survived the collapse of worlds. And in that sense, the Grail has always delivered. Not by being found, but by remaining unresolved. If the Grail were recovered, it would become a museum piece. If it were disproven, it would fade into obscurity. Instead, it persists, because it occupies a space that cannot be excavated, between belief and doubt, between history and imagination, between what is known and what is felt. This is why the Grail continues to attract seekers in every age, not because it promises answers, but because it legitimizes the search itself. The Grail does not demand belief. It invites reflection. It asks what we inherit, what we guard, and what we pass on. And perhaps that is why the Grail endures when so many other myths have faded. It is not bound to one time, or one place, or one truth. It adapts, quietly. As long as people sense that history is incomplete, as long as authority feels imperfect, as long as meaning feels fragile, the Grail will remain, not as a treasure to be uncovered, but as a question that refuses to disappear.